active faith. In my early 20s, long before I began studying theology and before I was ordained as a preacher, I was appointed to serve as a youth deacon. Usually, sons of pastoral families were exempt from this responsibility. But since I came from a non-believing family, I needed to go through this process to learn about church administration and procedures. At that time, our pastor, though he himself had a disability, was deeply dedicated to serving people who found it difficult to attend church because of their own disabilities. So after the Sunday morning service, before the evening service began, we would go to the pastor's home in a special apartment complex for the disabled and hold worship services for the residents there. One day, without any prior notice, the pastor asked me to lead the service. Having only been a believer for a few years, and always being on the receiving side of worship, suddenly being asked to lead was overwhelming and nerve-wracking. The sermon I gave that day was from the book of James, but looking back, it was unpolished and far from adequate. Years later, after becoming a pastor, I returned to the book of James to prepare another sermon. At that time, I came across the old manuscript I had written in my 20s. Reading it made me cringe with embarrassment. But that moment of discomfort led me to an important realization. The words of James that I had preached over 20 years earlier were the very same words I was preparing to preach again. Those words were also the same 200 years ago, and even earlier. Yet although the words were unchanged, the spiritual truths I now see were truths I had completely missed back then. When we come to understand a passage of Scripture, we often say, "God has made me realize this," or "God has given me this word for my situation." But in reality, the truth has always been there. It is just that at times we are unable to see or grasp it because of our lack of insight, wisdom, or spiritual maturity. The reason I am able to perceive those truths now is because back in my 20s, I had not yet grown enough in faith to recognize them. You might wonder, what is the difference between believing that God has revealed this to me and realizing that my growth in faith allowed me to see it? It might sound like a subtle distinction, but the difference is very significant. If we think, God has caused me to realize this, it can lead to a passive faith, where we feel there is little for us to do ourselves and no need to refresh or strengthen our stance in faith. But if we recognize that our understanding comes through growth in faith, we take an active position. It encourages us to press forward and be intentional in our spiritual journey. Of course, whether we gain something in the world or in our faith, it is always by God's grace. Nothing comes apart from what He allows. But what I want to emphasize is this. Just as results in the world can vary depending on our effort and diligence, the measure of grace we experience also differs depending on our thirst and longing for truth. Unfortunately, many believers adopt a passive stance in faith, saying, "God will lead us," without actively engaging or striving. As a result, they remain stuck in the same spiritual state, never moving deeper into God's grace. The grace of the Word is always present and available, but the depth of truth we can see depends on our spiritual growth. Those who are less mature may only glimpse a small part of the truth in Scripture, while those who have grown more deeply can see and discern much more. Therefore, strive for deeper growth. This means approaching Scripture with an active and intentional heart, seeking the truths it contains. That is why the Lord said the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who press on eagerly and forcefully. So grow in the truth, because within it lies our greatest treasure.
구독, 좋아요, 알림 설정 해주세요. Subscribe, like, set notifications.